Hi, this is Matt, the co-founder of the HMO platform, and today I'm joined by Paul Davis of Nimbus Maps for this week's Spotlight sessions. So Paul, over to you. Give us a little bit of background about yourself and what you get up to these days.
Yeah, so I'm Paul Davis. I'm from Nimbus Maps, one of the co-founders here at Nimbus. I suppose my role here is trying to think up kind of cool new things you can do with data and technology and apply in the property industry to help you kind of find decent opportunities and help work out what they are, decent opportunities I think they are, before you kind of get too emotionally committed to them, really. So that's kind of me in a nutshell, really.
And so I suppose just to summarize that, Nimbus Maps is a bit of a platform that people can go on and find potential property deals and land, help to appraise it, look at comparables, and it's a very cool tool. And we use it in our business, and all of our clients use it as well. We include it in our packages because it does quite a lot of funky stuff with HMOs and helping us to do that as well. But I suppose we can go into that a bit later. Let's go back in time a little bit, and why or how did you get into a tech company? Because it wasn't your background in property.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, so kind of in fact, I've got a few little slides actually, which kind of might help bring to life. Actually, let me just see if I can bring some pictures up that might kind of make life interesting. So give me just a second, and we're going to just let me just do this a second. So really, kind of our journey was kind of an interesting one, really, because it started off really as property investor developers, and I suppose, like all hopefully interesting stories, they sort of start with little glitz and glamour. And in our case, kind of glitz and glamour really looked something slightly strange, really. It sort of looked like this, and it was kind of our sort of model at the time as property investors was, I suppose, similar to an HMO kind of model, really. It was kind of high yielding assets, but in our case, most of it was commercial. And what was kind of interesting for us is to get a good yield off the back of buildings, and then some sort of cheap debt, I suppose, at the time. Kind of this is sort of the early 2000s kind of time. And what was kind of interesting, though, in this sort of asset class, this was a site that we owned in a place called Tyseley in Birmingham, so not too far away from where Peaky Blinders was set. So kind of a not a particularly glamorous part of Birmingham, but it was kind of got some good yields off industrial buildings. And the challenge we had was obviously with sort of high yield industrial buildings is if you don't knock them down, they kind of fall down. And so we sort of ended up on this journey of moving from that sort of stuff into redeveloping. And this is actually the site that we owned here, and it's kind of world pre-Nimbus Maps. It sort of shows that sort of this was the site here. It's kind of this sort of 5-acre site, and sort of 2/3 of it was in flood zone 2, and the other rest of it was in kind of flood zone 3, which was kind of a real problem for us when you're sort of trying to redevelop stuff. And so what was kind of interesting, we kind of got it out of the ground, but it was sort of a bit of an ordeal kind of getting to that point. And this is it here. But what was then happened is we had a site nearby to that to this particular pub here, which so we owned the little parade of shops on the right hand side there. What was kind of interesting in that, so it was in that kind of investment world, we got a bunch of assets, and in our case we had some interest in this little parade of shops from Sainsbury's, who we couldn't fit onto the site. So we ended up, like a lot of our customers, writing some neighbouring owners and this sort of stuff, and ended up hitting the pub company here over the road just around the time of the credit crunch. So they'd had sort of huge expansions, it was all kind of exciting, buy, sort of building up these huge portfolios of pubs. And then of course the smoking ban happened, and people stopped going out and drinking because they couldn't smoke in the pubs anymore. Then Lehman Brothers went bust in 2008, which meant the global credit crunch, and we got money to spend. So they went from these kind of real boom years into these kind of real kind of problem years, and then they had to sell a lot of assets. And so what happened for us is that we hit them at the right time, and we ended up sort of starting some development, having worked out how not to do developments in the case of Coral River Park. We then sort of by definition doing completely the opposite of what we'd done on that one. We then knew how to develop stuff out. And so we did an awful lot of this sort of stuff where we were kind of developing out. This was Mason's Arms up in Hucknall in Nottingham. We did this with it. We did kind of good old school shop with uppers, where this was a cafe near in Farnham that we did. Through to this sort of stuff. This was Silver Jubilee in Canvey Island, where we did that one for Morrison's, actually some housing at the back. And into this we did sort of loads, like sort of 200 odd schemes like this, where we were doing sort of reorientating car parks and sort of creating, in this case, private housing. This was Carbon Arms up in Stroud. And then right the way through to the other end of that, which was this sort of stuff, which was Lonsdale in Thurmston in Leicester, where we did sort of a affordable housing scheme on it rather than the private house. So kind of really sort of pushed into all those different kind of use classes and sectors and this sort of stuff, because we had this sort of issue, which was this one, which was all about scale. So how do you apply local knowledge when you go from a single site to 100 sites to 1,000 sites to 10,000 sites? How do you kind of take that local knowledge with you? And that is really kind of then when we hit that sort of scale problem, where we started to realize actually we could apply this more broadly. It kind of, as we sort of cracked that problem, we actually made some kind of interesting impacts with a little kind of graph here that sort of shows some of the planning applications for change of use from pubs into something else. We're just basically applying technology around all of that, really. So that's kind of really how we got to sort of applying data and technology. We had this sort of portfolio of thousands and thousands of pubs, and saying, well, actually, for each one of those, how do you work out which ones might work for a different use, a different sort of got a bunch of sort of strategies in our mind about how we might kind of add value to them. But obviously, short of getting in the car and driving around 10,000 pubs to work out which ones worked, and bringing up local agents and this sort of stuff, how do we kind of thin that down? And data and technology was the answer. And really, that's kind of where this came from as a sort of a starting point, really.
And just to clarify, these pubs, you were working on behalf of the pub owner, and helping them to develop the sites. And were you joint venturing with them, or were you just consulting with them? How are you doing that?
Yeah, so there's kind of a combination of various bits and pieces, really, sort of depending on the pub company and who kind of wanted to do what, in effect. But everything from holding the PLC's hand through the whole kind of cradle to grave piece on the developments, through to retained by Sainsbury's and Co-op, people like that, to go and find sites for them. Sort of morphed into some joint venture kind of stuff where we're buying sites and selling them subject to convenience operating, this sort of stuff. But sort of the bread and butter was kind of consultancy work. PLC instructs you to do this piece of work to them, look at this portfolio of sites, and you unlock sort of various sites through that process, really. So that's kind of where the pressure to look at kind of large estates and sort of work out how do you thin down to get that local knowledge onto these sites, to work out which ones do work and which ones don't. It's kind of where that pressure came from, really. And I think also because the sort of assets we were working with were kind of quite small, but a huge number of them. That's a kind of a different problem, really, because most developers, most investors you sort of spend more on each of your assets. You have a similar size portfolio or number of properties. You just buy bigger ones, and you do kind of more within each deal, because it's as hard to knock up a 5 acre site as a 100 acre site. You just spend more money on a single site rather than, and so that was kind of sort of the big developers weren't particularly bothered, because it was kind of this, it's just sort of too small and too fiddly. But actually, you could create quite a lot of scale out of that, because you've got lots and lots of small sites that you were kind of unlocking, basically. So it was a sort of particularly unique challenge we faced, really.
And that was where technology could come in and help you to just speed up that analysis, because 10,000 sites, as you say, is a scale problem. How do you analyze and find the value in a whole number of sites rather than that one large site where it's quite easy to see, where you just do
absolutely
a whole number of houses? And
absolutely.
Then was that quite clear it was going to be Nimbus Maps?
It wasn't really, no. It's interesting, because sort of there was people kind of didn't really get it, I suppose. It's kind of it was very interesting. Kind of different people kind of did get it, didn't get it, and you hear a lot, well, I know my local patch, and so what are you going to teach me on there? And it's like, well, you don't know the other patches, and of course a lot of these requirements are national requirements, and so you kind of don't necessarily know what they're interested in, because actually they haven't had a requirement on your particular local patch, now if you don't know who they are. And so there's kind of a lot of it was kind of interesting sort of watching that sort of whole thing evolve, really. And it was, I think for us, it was very interesting. One of the very early things that was, so obviously Nimbus plots titles on a map and this sort of stuff, so you can see kind of ownership and this sort of stuff, and that becomes really interesting for a whole load of different reasons. But we had we first plotted a title on a map back in 2014 or something like that. It was a particular piece of work we'd got for one of the big pub companies who'd done some analysis to say, so like all the big sort of retailers are going to do, they'll sort of do a bit of a demographic analysis saying these are the areas we want to go and work in. And they've done that on a whole portfolio of pubs, and we sort of plotted these titles on the map for them. And it was kind of interesting because we put that in front of a very senior person at one of the big retailers in the UK, sort of saying, look at this, you know, we got it on my phone. We're kind of at a property reception that kind of they were running, and said, look at this, and there's a picture of a title plot on the map. And he was a little bit drunk, but he was like, what are we looking at? And it's like, that is actually the fundamental underlying technology that Nimbus Maps builds on. And it's it was really interesting. Just didn't kind of see what we saw on it. It was really interesting. So yeah, it wasn't necessarily, it was quite clear to us where we were going to take it and what we wanted to do with it, but it wasn't necessarily quite so clear to others at the time, which is kind of where sort of the challenge comes from. It's kind of interesting.
Yeah, I think seeing the value in technology, I think because property is a very, it's quite an old school business with a lot of old school thinkers.
Yeah.
So it's definitely not a fast mover when it comes to technology, and prop tech is a word which is now being bandied around quite a lot, and people getting quite interested in this whole new prop tech industry, and applying technology, artificial intelligence to the industry. I think people struggle to see how it can help, because they're like, well, it's just a bricks and mortar, it's a piece of land, you know, how on earth can technology help me? And you know, at the HMO platform, we use a methodology called our tenant first methodology, and there's 5 strands to it: focus, insight, R&D, review and deliver, service and thrive. And I think that those first, in fact, well, technology can apply to each of those strands, but where I think Nimbus Maps really comes into its own is in kind of that insight piece. So gaining insight into planning, the place and the properties, that's where it can really have a huge impact. So if someone was to look at Nimbus and say, well, how do I use it to find a site, or get a bit of information about a site, how might they use it kind of at a high level? Like, what can it do?
Yeah. Well, I suppose can just pick up, before I answer the question, can I pick up what you make there? I think for us, there's a lot of technology out there looking for an application, rather than starting off with, well, what is the problem that we've actually got, and then you worry about the technology and say, well, how can we fix that problem, rather than we've got all this great technology, look how exciting it is, and and so I think there's kind of a sort of a subtle difference with that. And I think what's kind of interesting when it comes to how can you use Nimbus at a high level to find sites, it's really in essence the same way that you'd be doing it normally, which is, if I want to go and find an HMO location, I want to go and find a place where there are some other HMOs, there's a marketplace there that's kind of got a demand that I can then go and tap into, and there's a reason why there's HMOs there at the moment. And then we want to be saying, well, actually, is there an Article 4 problem? What's my chance of getting from C4 to sui generis? How do I get that commercial valuation? And then it's kind of, so we want to kind of understand that calculation. Of course, computers are brilliant doing calculations. They're way better than we are. And so actually it sort of very naturally lends itself to, well, give that problem to the computer. The computer can just answer it for us, and we can then worry about other stuff at the same time. And then it sort of moves into, if I'm going to take a house and convert it to an HMO, ideally I want to buy the smallest house I can on the biggest piece of land that I can, so I can then extend it. I can buy it cheaply and I can extend it heavily to then really drive the yields out the back of those. And so, I want to be seeing that in locations where there's a planning history for a similar sort of thing. I don't want to go and pick the worst street on the best house and buy that one. And so the technology just really kind of allows you to do all of that. So then within all of that, then a lot of the issues around, well, what's it worth when it's done? What's it worth to buy now? Kind of, comparables and this sort of stuff. Often that's been very tricky in the past, trying to find your HMO comps and things like that. And there's just some simple tricks from our point of view in terms of the way we sort of bring information together to then give you that insight, as you say, kind of, these are all the houses that have sold, which of those were HMOs at the time, and did they have a license in place and planning in place at the time, so we know that they're actually sold as the HMO rather than sold as a house, and that sort of stuff. And so it just kind of brings all of that together. But there's kind of then also other tricks around, well, actually the consultants that you want to use as part of that are the ones that got the track record in the local area, that have the ear of the HMO officer, and of the council and the planning, the planners and this sort of stuff. And actually, again, you can use the tool to go and find those people, to make sure you're speaking to the right people, and look at the kind of schemes they've done elsewhere, and kind of check that what they're doing is the right sort of stuff, really. Because actually we found, so on that kind of journey we went through, the reason that the very first slide that I showed you, that kind of problem with Corriver Park and Peaky Blinders all flooding, you know, if we'd looked at the consultants that we had at the time in the same lens that we look at now through the data sets we've got here at Nimbus, we'd never instructed them, and we'd never had the problems that we had sort of through that journey. And so really what we've tended to find with Nimbus actually is that we're just mapping what we found was useful historically and the stuff that impressed us historically. We're mapping the technology to what we found useful at the time. And ultimately that's kind of where you find a lot of value in it, because actually, how do I pick the worst street on the right, sort of the worst house on the best street in a location, and how do I pick the right architect and planner to go and support, to go and get that consent, and how do I know whether I'm going to get a consent or not, and where are those pockets of value that I'd love to go and buy something in Nottingham town centre where I can do an HMO scheme over there, but it's so densely packed with HMOs, surely I'm never going to get it, or it's too difficult to just move on. Well, there are still 1 or 2 buildings in there that will still work, and actually those then become really exciting. So high level terms, it's really the same as you do elsewhere, but just with a sort of the technology to kind of take that weight out of it and kind of give you the opportunity to kind of really drive a lot more leads and sort of be a bit more, I suppose, looking to sort of the different little areas, the little kind of pockets, little niches that kind of really drive huge value, rather than sort of just running along with the tide.
I think one of the biggest problems you're solving here is time. So everything you talked about, you know, you can go and do kind of yourself, either by walking around the streets and you have a look and you can see, oh, that's got the small one, yeah, that's the small house on the large plot. Yeah, you can, even with Google these days, you can kind of have a quick look, and things like checking out HMO registers, you can go and do that yourself. Checking planning policies, you can go and do that yourself. But I suppose from our perspective, from the HMO front, that has taken me hours upon hours upon hours of searching and researching and gaining that insight in those particular areas for a particular property as well. And it's definitely when you're looking for projects, you want to be able to very quickly sift through them and go, okay, that one is a potential, that one's not potential, and not, and not have to spend a couple of hours on a project before you realize actually no, it doesn't work. So how we use Nimbus is a massive time saver. And when we first started talking about the potential for HMO information within Nimbus, it became quite clear that all we needed was a bit of tweaking to bring in a bit more data, and again, your software to just do the calculations that it can spit out the answer, and very clearly spit out the answer. So when where else can you go and find a sold price of an HMO? Where else is there anywhere else you can go find a sold price of an HMO? Well, you could go and ring up some agents and say, have you sold any HMOs recently? Or we go in Nimbus and get the history of the sold price history of a particular postcode within a certain radius, and again, it tells you whether it's an HMO on the license register or not. And since 2018, when all HMOs over 5 and above have to be registered and licensed, it means that you've got a quite clear view of where those sold comparables are. So from our perspective, that's a huge time saver, and just being able to identify those sites which are just low density, where there's a potential to extend and get more on them, I think it is invaluable, especially when you're working with existing HMOs and you've got that permission in place already. So that's essentially, I think, how we get the most value out of it, and how it suits us as a customer of Nimbus. You mentioned about wanting to provide that. Yeah,
probably a little stage above that as well, because I think, kind of, as you say, you could do it on a per building kind of basis. You could kind of go and work this out and spend a few hours doing it all. And I think what usually happens is you could, but you don't, unless you're very motivated, and actually kind of, some people will, and that kind of then give them a sort of a bit of a head start on the competition, because they'll sort of dig out a little corner and pocket where they can really kind of focus in on it. But I think when you put it all together, then it allows you to kind of stand back from it and say, well, actually, kind of where are those key strategic places I can go and choose. And actually, I'm always kind of quite a big fan when you're doing development of having multiple exits, so you're not kind of, if something goes wrong along that journey, in an HMO case, perhaps there's some huge, we're targeting a student town or whatever, there's some huge student block that suddenly gets a planning ticket just the day you've signed and exchanged on your building or whatever. Then, how do you protect yourself against that? Well, you do it in an area where the residential buyers work, and actually there's a letting market as well. And actually that allows you kind of to focus on the HMO marketplace for all the benefits you get from that, but then not suffer from the downside if there is something that kind of crops up that you couldn't possibly have expected, really. And so I think it allows you to be very strategic in your approach. That otherwise you have to go and look at every single town and do that sort of 2 or 3 hour analysis each time round across all those different areas, and then sort of try to work out which one of those you were going to go for, which just becomes an enormous piece of work that you just never get around to doing. And kind of the world kind of takes over as part of that. So I think there's kind of some really useful stuff that it can do just to kind of help kind of ask those questions around the sort of the plans and where and why and how and what kind of stuff you target, really, which I think is very hard to do without having that kind of complete view of the world, really.
No, definitely. Because you kind of got this, a lot of anecdotal evidence that people rely on when so a lot of people are not into the detail and don't like to go into this level of kind of analysis. And what I quite like about the options is that you don't actually have to be analytical to use a tool like Nimbus, because you just need to know what you're looking for. So if we know that we're looking for an area which isn't a deprived area where whether people want to live, we can take our anecdotal evidence that we find from the ground through asking people on the ground, asking agents, asking universities, asking employers, asking existing tenants and housemates. Then we can tie that in with, okay, where is a good area? We can go and turn on the HMO overlay and just go, oh, here are all the HMOs in town. We know that these are all probably mainly students because the university is just next door, and these ones over here are probably professionals or a combination of the two. And we can start to get an insight of, this is what people are doing right now. Is it the right thing to do to continue to put HMOs in these areas, or is there another opportunity elsewhere that is maybe growing? And you can take a really that view and tie the kind of anecdotal with the analytical, with the evidence, and you get a much better picture and a much better result.
Yeah, and what you should find is those all align, and where they do align, you have great confidence that what you're going to do is going to be successful. It's where they don't align that's very useful as well, because actually that doesn't mean to say that it won't work. It's just a question of, well, just do a bit more work and just think twice as hard around this one, because some things aren't quite lining up, which is, if you don't have that understanding, then there could be a surprise down the line that that's waiting for you. But if you've seen it and you know it's there, and you've seen and you can manage it, and you can sort of save yourself a lot of sleepless nights, actually, isn't it? Kind of, because properties are quite big. They're sort of big transactions. There's a lot of money that you're writing. A lot of it's some quite big impacts. When it goes wrong, it can go very wrong, can't it? So actually, sort of understanding what those problems might be and then being aware of them early means you can kind of either manage them through the process, or you can walk away early to make sure you don't get the wrong ones. So yeah, it's making sure it all aligns neatly is the key thing. I tend to find that the sort of the schemes you should commit to are the ones that you start getting pushed to exchange, don't you? And at the point of exchange, you get some things where everything sort of converges and sort of issues are ticked off and it's all kind of fine. And I get this thing back from the lawyers and it's all kind of yes, all fine, thanks. And sort of the conversion at that point, you should put your ink on the paper. But some sites kind of do the opposite, and you sort of get a report back and it doesn't quite answer the question that you've asked, and there's sort of more questions that come off the back of it all, and they sort of feel like they're sort of doing this. And those are the ones then that I always think are the ones to not sign the paperwork on. Those are the ones you kind of end up sort of making a round of drinks out of, rather than the proper 25% return on cost kind of thing. And that's sort of the key bit. And it's almost, you can sort of see that quite early often with if the data is just purely information. It's just kind of, does that information all align with what I'm being told? And if not, then it doesn't quite sound right, doesn't quite feel right, and actually kind of, well, either do more work on it or move on to the next one. I think that's the other thing that kind of can be useful, is that I think with property you get very kind of emotionally attached to a site, because you spend so much time working on it, and you sort of get really into the, and especially kind of with the HMOs, because you're really trying to put yourself into the customer's shoes and saying, well, actually, do I really want to live in this place, and is this really kind of better than, you know, living in a 1-bed flat or whatever. And so, you know, as you get so emotionally attached to it, as you've kind of gone on that journey with the building, you kind of, when they say, well, do you want to exchange or not, start pushing you to exchange, you kind of, every bit of your body saying yes, because I'm so emotionally attached to it. And kind of, that can be quite hard not to do it, unless you've got a pipeline of other projects that equally are looking attractive. Then you can just forget about that one and move on to the next one. I think that's a very powerful thing, to work out which ones you actually sign on the dotted line and buy, rather than not. It's something that we've always kind of struggled with. So, you know, well, pre-Nimbus Maps, it was, you know, you're trawling around agents, you're trawling around looking on agents' websites and commercial listing websites and this sort of stuff, trying to find opportunities. And those then are quite hard to find, especially, you know, to add value to, and this sort of thing. And so if you haven't got that pipeline, or you're trying to look after an agent or something like that, you feel like you've got to buy something that isn't really, it's kind of doing this, but you think, well, it'll be okay, and then you end up buying it and actually it isn't okay, or you sort of spend 2 years trying to get yourself out of the problem you've created. It's very difficult. But if you've got that steady pipeline of, well, there's lots more opportunities to go after, then I think that makes life a lot easier in a property business, to my mind.
Definitely. So you're right. It's about the pipeline. It's about not, you know, just saying this is the deal. This is the only deal I'm ever going to do. And we say this a lot with our clients. People get their head set on something and go, I've been looking for a site for 2 months and now I found it. And we're like, actually, no, you haven't found it. You found one of many potential opportunities. You know, that one, you may work on it for another 2 months and it still may fall out of bed.
Yeah.
So never stop looking for sites and build up that pipeline. And just what another good thing about Nimbus is the fact that you can build it into a pipeline, and build out that you know, those deals that you can track along the way. So getting all the information is one thing, and then managing workflow and everything is something which you can do as well. So, and it's interesting that you talked about you know, the problems that people face, and how obviously you created Nimbus out of a problem that you found, with the ability to, you know, analyze 10,000 sites. How do you identify them? You know, we were attracted to Nimbus by the fact that it could help us to solve our problems, which is, you know, how can we save time in appraising HMOs? How can we get the answers to some of the questions that we, you know, I would teach someone, take about an hour and a half to teach them how to do something, whereas we could just show them in 10 minutes how to do it on Nimbus. So it just saves them so much time. So I think we've got a bit of a shared vision and value in solving problems and having that kind of this customer first approach. So I mentioned, you know, our tenant first approach, which is, you know, if you put the tenant at the heart of everything, when you're creating a project, then you have very few issues. You have tenants which stay and they pay, and you create next level HMOs. And yeah, I think, didn't you quite quickly see that you wanted to do things differently as well?
Yeah. I think what's kind of interesting is that so kind of go back to that sort of first slide, as property investors, maybe sort of as commercial property investors, you're sort of taught that when you buy a site, the first thing that you want to do is let the tenant be late by a couple of weeks on their rent payment, and send the bailiff in and show them who's boss. You know, so that then they know going forward that, you know, you've got to pay your rent, and because we're the landlord and you're the tenant kind of thing. It's this very kind of parent-childy kind of very antiquated way of kind of managing anything. And of course, every other successful business across the whole of the world prides themselves, or should pride themselves, on putting the customer first and trying to delight the customer and trying to provide value and help that customer to achieve the things they want to achieve. And the companies that are best at that are the ones that are most successful, because they add value, they add serious value, and they look after their customers. The customers are happy. And so in the property industry, though, you've got this historic way of saying, well, I'm the landlord, you're the tenant, you pay the rent, and woe betide if you don't. Whereas actually the real world is sat there saying, well, customer service matters. the customer is the most important person in anything. And if you haven't got that kind of mindset in what you're creating, then people that do have that, you're going to prefer to go there, quite frankly. I think that the particularly successful companies in the property industry are very much doing that. And I think certainly HMOs as well, it's really, really important to be doing that, to be putting the customer first and making sure that you're really kind of thinking how they're thinking and working out how if you wouldn't want to live in that house, then why would they? It's either got to be cheap or they've got to be desperate. And it's like, well, that's not a place you want to be. It's kind of, so putting the tenant first, realizing the tenant is your customer rather than the tenant and someone to be beaten up, and realizing they're people rather than, is absolutely paramount, I think, to run things successfully. And it's, as a technology company, it's obvious. As a property company, it's less obvious. And I think there's other problems I think the property industry have got as well. I think kind of marketing is quite poor as well in the property industry. I think that's kind of something that, and I guess kind of customer first is very much a marketing thing anyway. But in terms of kind of making sure you're providing value to your customer and explaining that clearly to them what the value of that is. But yeah, sort of I'm a huge fan of that. I think there's other things around kind of split testing, letter campaigning, and this sort of stuff that I think the property industry's been particularly poor at in the past. But I think getting a lot better with this sort of stuff that we're doing now.
Yeah, I think it does come back to what we're talking about this kind of very old school industry, which is being dragged kicking and screaming into the modern age. And there will be a time where land registry is all online and things will work in the blockchain, and we have all of this. But it is a very difficult industry to do, because we have all these different parts of the puzzle, which you got solicitors that are still writing letters and waiting for post and all of this. And I think there's so many ways that the prop tech can improve the industry. And I've actually just come back from recording the audio version of my book and kind of rereading it, because I've not read it in a while since I wrote it. In fact, the last time I read it was when I did the final proof. But having reread it, there were a couple of bits which jumped out to me, which I'd kind of forgotten that I'd wrote. And one of them was about that tenant and landlord relationship. Yeah, I think you quite rightly said kind of this parent-child kind of overlord underling style relationship, which I think is just so antiquated and out of date. And a lot of those a lot of those terminologies I think are also quite poor. So when you've got the word landlord, even though my book is called Next Level Landlord, is actually quite a poor term for it, because the lord of the land, that lord and ladies, and it's a bit old school. And tenant as well, being that person who's accountable to the landlord, whereas actually if we start to view that as a kind of almost an equal relationship, where it's a service provider and a user of that service, then we get this much better kind of synergy where people know where they stand. So I think like the more old school landlords are the ones that are still going, it's a room, you just rent the room, and I'll give you the bare minimum what I'm willing to put in. I'll just go down to Argos or put in some furniture, or to IKEA, put in the cheap beds and everything, and it'll just work. And tenants are wising up to that now. As I said, we preferred words like housemates, residents, those types of words I think work a lot better, especially in the shared living marketplace. So housemates is the word that we use most often. So yeah, the housemates and the service provider, that is where we are, and that's essentially where we get to more of a co-living approach towards HMOs.
And sort of, I suppose that approach never more kind of relevant than now, is it? If you've been locked up in your own flat for the last 12-18 months, it'd be miserable, wouldn't it? Was actually if you're in a house where your landlord actually cared about you and was actually trying to help and trying to make it as nice as possible, and actually you got on well with the housemates that you were there with, it would be a delight to live in that location, rather than living in a one-bed flat on your own, sort of crawling up the walls as you're in lockdown and this sort of stuff. It would be a sort of poles apart in terms of the experience you've had over that 12-month period. And so I think I totally agree. It's about making sure that your customer's happy, and realizing your tenant is that customer rather than, because they're the ones that pay the rent and that pays the bills, So
yeah, and if they stop paying, then you've got no income. So I think, and one thing I talk about is nurturing relationships. So you want positive relationships and positive communication. As soon as it becomes, if things start to go wrong, it's how you resolve those issues. And if you've got a positive relationship with someone, then those issues are quite easily resolved, as opposed to if you've got this negative relationship, which a lot of agents and landlords almost instill in the tenant. It comes back to what you talked about, that sending the bailiffs round. If you miss your first month's rent as a tenant, not necessarily on purpose, maybe because you forgot to set up your standing order, or it's come on the wrong day, and the first thing you get is a kind of a letter from the agent saying, we're going to charge you interest. You're late. If you're late again, then we'll issue the section 21 or section 8. And we're just like, well, that's not a good level of service. And that happened to me on the last place that I rented, and as a tenant myself. And I think I missed the rent by one day. And I kind of the 9 a.m. the day after the rent was due, I got that letter basically emailed to me. I'm just like, excuse me?
What?
All you had to do was just send a quick reminder, say, rent is due, or rent was due yesterday, can you please pay it? Then it would have, it was straight away. But now I knew straight away that that agent was, first of all, you didn't really want to mess with them, but also I also know you my rights as a tenant, but also being in the industry, I was like, well, I think there's better ways of doing business. And we have, even over the pandemic, we've had a couple of tenants who've had issues paying, and we found payment plans and worked with them. Now they're back up to date, and are much more likely to stay longer. They're back in a good position.
It's a two-way street as well, isn't it?
Yeah,
I totally agree with that. And I think we've certainly found that if you're sympathetic to the problems that people have, actually it goes a long way. So when they're down, if you help them when they're down, that does, the question is, are they really down, or are they trying to pretend that they're down? That's kind of more tricky to understand. But if you can kind of get that right, then they do stay. They repay it in spades. They're kind of literally sort of just delighted that you've helped. And I think the other thing that's kind of interesting in terms of what you were saying is that the day that you've moved into your new house, you've got other things going on in your mind as well. Because you've got, I'm in a house with all these people I've never met before. I'm trying to make friends. I'm probably thinking about, well, perhaps I'll make dinner for everybody and try and settle into my new house. And then suddenly you get that through the post that says, by the way, chap, you've got to. It's like, well, it's just, you've got plenty of other pressures on you at that point, and so you can just see how that could really sour relationships so quickly. And it's really not kind of going to make you want to stay in that place. It's sort of emotionally you're going to move on and say, well, I'm going to go.
Yeah, and actually, you make that decision quite early on. You say, this I don't enjoy that bit of communication, and I'm going to take that first opportunity. As soon as, I'm not going to choose to stay here, if a better opportunity comes, I'm going to go. Whereas if they have a positive experience, then again, more likely to stay. If an opportunity comes up, they might be like, actually, no, I quite like it here, I'm going to stay. Whereas when I got that letter, I was like, well, yeah, I don't want to deal with these agents. I'll never use these agents to manage any of my properties. And fundamentally, they apparently were award-winning, and it just didn't seem to make any sense and having asked around a little bit more about the industry in that particular area, it's basically made a lot of sense what happened. So they're quite well known for being kind of very a stickler for being very, very to the point. No, non-flexible, I think is the word. Inflexible, that's the word. Yes, definitely. But well, I just want to say thanks, Paul, for sharing some time and knowledge with me today. And And so Nimbus Maps, if people are interested in Nimbus, how can they get in touch? If they want to see these features in action, what can they do?
Yeah, so we run webinars every week. So we sort of have sort of various topics that we cover where we sort of talk about industry problems, and we sort of talk about how Nimbus can be used to kind of help those kind of problems. We've got kind of various products. We've got a free product where you can sort of play around with that to get some ownership and see some planning constraints and this sort of stuff. And so you can log in and have a go with that yourself. We offer a free trial of the more powerful Elite platform. So you get sort of 14 days of going to play around with that. So it's our website, www.nimbusmaps.co.uk. So you can sign up for a free trial on that. You can use the free version on that as well. And we've got a team in the office that will run you through one-to-one demonstration if you want to do that, to kind of really understand how you can use it in an HMO environment or any other kind of environment as well. So yeah, nimbusmaps.co.uk is the place to go.
Brilliant. And just a reminder that when we work with clients, we see Nimbus as an invaluable part of getting that solution. So we're very much a training provider which is solution driven. So the aim is to get projects and have them completed, not just to learn about how to do it and watch from the sidelines. So and we know that Nimbus is a very key part of that. So for our clients we work with, it is included in our package. So yeah, they get all of that plus the HMO Elite stuff, which is Elite Plus, which is really cool. So thanks again, Paul.
Thank you, Matt.
And thank you for watching and for listening, and catch you in the next Spotlight session.